Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bob Rawson. It's my honor to be the interim dean of the Case Western Reserve School of Law, and in that capacity to welcome all of you to what will be a terrific afternoon. This is the Sumner Canary Lecture, and there's a lot of competition for this honor, but it may well be the most prestigious of our lecture series. And it is a lecture in honor of the memory of the late Judge Sumner Canary, who was a distinguished judge on the Ohio Court of Appeals for the 8th District and also served as U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Ohio. The lecture was made possible by the generosity of Judge Canary's widow, Nancy Canary. Unfortunately, Mrs. Canary could not be with us this afternoon. And it's my honor to introduce our Canary lecturer for this occasion, and he is Jack Goldsmith, who is the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law at the Harvard Law School. He served as Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice from 2003 to 2004. Was special counsel to the General Counsel to the Department of Defense in 2002 and 2003. He also, before joining the government, clerked for Justice Anthony Kennedy on the U.S. Supreme Court, and before that for J. Harvey Wilkinson on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, and Judge George Aldrich on the Iran-U.S. Claims Tribunal. Previously, in the academic sphere, he taught at the Chicago Law School and at the University of Virginia Law School. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Terror Presidency, Law and Judgment Inside the Bush Administration, about which the Los Angeles Times wrote, quote, an important book, a genuine service to national interest on several levels. He's also the author of several other books, including Who Controls the Internet, Illusions of a Borderless World, The Limits of International Law, and case books in foreign relations law and the conflict of law. The topic of today's lecture is the cyber threat. Hard to imagine a more timely topic given the, among other things, the current imbroglio between China and Google and all kinds of other multilateral issues in the area of Professor Goldsmith's expertise. Ladies and gentlemen, my pleasure to introduce Jack Goldsmith. Jack.
Thank you, Dean, for that very kind introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me here today. It's a real honor to be here today. So I'm going to talk about the cyber threat, which I will explain in a moment. Basically, I'm going to try to explain what's been in the news about, there have been a growing raft of stories about cybersecurity, cyber threats, cyber attacks, cyber exploitations. I'm going to try to explain what the threat is. I'm going to try to explain how law is relevant to the threat, both domestic and international law. I'm going to explain what kind of legal reforms would be necessary to possibly bring the threat under control. I'm going to explain why I am pessimistic that we will be able to reach those reforms. And then I'm going to close by speculating where we'll go in the near and medium term. I'm going to use slides, which is unusual for me and unusual for a lecture. And my friend Jonathan Adler was teasing me on the way over here because he said these are the lowest tech slides I've ever seen in my life. And for such a high-tech talk, it seems strange that you would use such low-tech slides. But in fact, I'm a very low-tech guy, and so my slides are low-tech as well. I apologize if they offend you. So let's start with a couple of pages of things that are in the news. And of course, the thing that's most prominently in the news on the front page of the newspaper today is Google deciding to shut down, or at least it's basically removing its search capacities from China, from within inside China. It is temporarily directing all searches from inside China on Google CN to a site in Hong Kong. But basically, this means that the Chinese, and this is also in the news today, the Chinese will be able to filter that. So essentially, it looks like China's getting out of the search business in China. Now, why is China doing that? Why is Google doing that? They're doing it ostensibly because of an attack last December in January by the Chinese, or someone in China, I should say more specifically, on Google's computer systems, first in China, we think, and then in the United States, to both steal source code, Google source code allegedly, very important intellectual property that Google owns at the bottom of its amazing search capacities, and also to break into the accounts of human rights activists, the Google accounts of human rights activists. And Google, in an extraordinary act, went public with this. As I'm going to talk about, most firms that are attacked or exploited on the internet don't disclose it. There's a powerful incentive not to. Google did disclose it. It's not clear why. It may have been charitable, it may have been benign motives, it may not have been. But they disclosed it, and ostensibly one of the reasons they're leaving is because of this cyber threat. And this, a lot of people, this cyber attack by the Chinese, and I'm going to talk about the Chinese because we really don't know who did it yet. And that's part of the big problem in this area, is the so-called attribution problem. In any event, that's been in the front page of the paper. That's a very important cyber attack story. Some others that I'll run through more quickly. It was reported, you probably heard about our amazing drone capacity and the capacity of these unmanned aerial vehicles to circle for 24 hours above the skies without a pilot, with a pilot located in a room in the United States somewhere, having amazing sensors so we can have as close to omniscience on the battlefield as we've ever had before. And it turns out that the Iraqi insurgents were downloading the feeds from these amazing robots that we have in the air. At last December, it was disclosed that they were downloading the feeds from these drones onto their computers with a piece of $26 software. And this raises a larger issue, and again, I'm going to circle back to this, but our military has, in the last few decades, committed to something it calls net-centric warfare, which is basically, to make a long story short, the computerization and the interconnection of computer systems and telecommunication systems within the military so that everything is interconnected to everything else. You can leverage power in a lot of ways if you do this, and this is one small example, but it also exposes you to enormous vulnerabilities, which we're just starting to realize in the last few years. Another matter in the news was the cyber attack by North Korea on U.S. and South Korean governmental websites last January, a denial of service attack. Basically, it was a botnet, which I'm going to talk about, sending thousands and hundreds of thousands of messages to certain websites and crashing them. Now, I say it was by North Korea, but again, we still don't know where the attack came from 8 months later. It was reported that it came from North Korea for the first few weeks, and then a few weeks later they said, well, maybe it was actually a computer in Miami where it started. And this is a giant problem in this area, and it's one of the themes of this lecture, is that attribution, as this problem is called, knowing who and what and which government, if any, is behind these attacks, is very hard to know with certainty. And if you think about that for a moment, if something really bad can happen to you and you have a hard time knowing who did it, then it's very hard for law and deterrence and most of our traditional conceptions of defense and regulation to work. And this is one of the big challenges that cyber presents to us. A spokesman for the Director of National Intelligence said last April that we have seen Chinese network operations inside our electricity grids. They've seen software agents that they think came from China inside the computer systems associated with our electrical grids. They don't know why they're there or what they're doing. They don't know if they're just snooping around or planning an attack later. There was a software breach last year in the Joint Strike Fighter program, which is a $30 billion, the most expensive fighter military procurement program we have now. Excuse me. Allegedly, several terabytes of data were downloaded and stolen about the design and electronics of the system, and many people think it will be much easier for adversaries to defend against the system with this knowledge. A couple more stories that have been in the news, and I could go on forever and ever. I just want to give you a flavor of it. The Russians crippled Georgian governmental websites and Estonian bank and governmental sites in 2008 and 2009. These were very prominent denial of service attacks. I say Russians, but we still don't know who in Russia did it. We think it came from so-called patriotic hackers, individuals who are motivated by patriotic means, who have uncertain associations with the state. It was also reported in the New York Times, this was actually reported last July, that the Department of Defense was attacked 360 million times in the first 6 months, and it spent in the first 6 months over $100 million repairing damage. Now that 360 million figure seems impossible, until you start thinking about the fact that there are 2 billion, over 200 billion emails every day, and that these attacks and exploitations and pings on systems can be automated. And finally, President Obama, in a speech last year, reported, and I'm not sure where the sourcing is for this, but he said that cyber criminals stole approximately $1 trillion in intellectual property in 2008. A lot of people think that figure is low, because firms that have their intellectual property stolen do not have an incentive to report. Why do they not have an incentive to report? If they report, it can give their competitors advantage. It can chill customers. It can drop their stock price. There's a powerful incentive not to report these things. I could go on and on. These are pulled from the front pages of newspapers, and I'm sure you've seen them all. If the news reports are scary, the government is really scared. And I just want to give you 2 quotes. This is President Obama from a very important speech last May. From now on, our digital infrastructure, the networks and computers we depend on every day, will be treated as a strategic national asset. Protecting this infrastructure will be a national security priority. And then the Director of National Intelligence under George Bush, Michael McConnell, said, a coordinated attack from a remote location by a small group on our electric grid, transportation network, and banking system could create damage as potentially great as a nuclear weapon over time. And he did not think he was exaggerating. So this is what I'm going to talk about today. What is going on here? What is all this about? Is it real? Why is this happening? And what, if anything, does law have to do with it? I'm going to try to focus on the legal aspects of this. There are many, many other issues that I will touch on that are related to this: technological issues, economic issues, social issues, educational issues. There are many dimensions to this problem. I've never encountered in my life anything with near this complexity. I'm going to try to focus my talk on what law has to do with it. So this is the outline. I'm going to give you a few slides of background about the nature of the technical problem and the nature of the characteristics of the problem. I'm going to talk briefly about how law regulates offshore threats in real space. To give you we suffer all sorts of threats and attacks from outside our borders, and law deals with these fairly effectively. I'm going to run through that before I show you in the third part why I think that there are enormous gaps in legal regulation for the cyber problem. Then I'm going to walk through some of the more obvious reforms that need to be done and explain why they are hard to do politically and economically. And then I'm going to close by talking about the future. First, I want to talk about a distinction between cyber attack and cyber exploitation. This is an important distinction. A cyber attack, this is a distinction that's generally drawn in the circles who worry about these things. It's in the Department of Defense terms, distinguishes between computer network attack and computer network exploitation. An important National Research Council study distinguishes between cyber attack and cyber exploitation. Cyber attack is cyber activity that disrupts, degrades, or destroys information on a computer system. It's basically some kind of agent that gets into a computer system that does something bad to the data, that corrupts the data or the experience of the data. So, for example, banking data can be destroyed or corrupted in a way that we lose confidence in the banking data. That would be an example of a cyber attack. Military command and control system could be interrupted so that the command could not communicate with the soldiers in the field. The electrical grid could be affected, either taken over or shut down or manipulated or slowed down. Or computers could just start slowing down because they're running code that they don't know about, and they aren't as fast as they would normally be. So an attack is something that degrades or slows down or disrupts or destroys the data. Cyber exploitation, by contrast, activity that monitors, spies, or copies information on a computer system, but doesn't disturb the normal functioning of the computer system from the user's point of view. So this is basically espionage and theft, which you can do by copying, but it doesn't do anything at all to affect your experience as perceived or in reality of the system itself. And this is an important distinction that runs throughout this area. Now here are the basic characteristics of the cyber problem. And some of this gets technical, and I'm going to try to be as non-technical as I can, because as I said, I am non-technical. I know as much about the technology as I need to know to understand the law, maybe just one tick more, I hope. The first characteristic of the problem is I said interdependence, that's a mistake. Dependence is the word I meant. Our growing dependence on computer systems, computer networks, telecommunication systems. We're becoming increasingly wired in every aspect of our life. And with this wiring, and it could say interconnection, becomes a dependence on these systems. Do we know how to bank anymore? Do we know how to shop anymore? Do we know how to conduct a military anymore? Do we know how to conduct intelligence anymore without computer systems? Increasingly not. We're increasingly reliant on these systems to do every aspect of life, economics, commercial transactions, and the like. With this dependence comes vulnerability, because the more dependent we are, then the more subject we are to disruption if these systems can be successfully attacked. Second characteristic is that computers and computer networks and telecommunication systems are hugely insecure. They're very hard to make secure from attack or exploitation. There are a lot of reasons for this. I'll mention a few in very simple terms. First, computer systems and both hardware and software are very, very complex and growing in complexity. And with complexity becomes vulnerabilities. And holes and vulnerabilities that are very hard for the maker or the user of the system to see, especially when various softwares interact or a software interacts with a piece of hardware. Herman Kahn, the famous nuclear theorist, the person who was the Dr. Strangelove was based on Herman Kahn. He was a nuclear strategist at Rand and a futurist, and he famously said that the aggressor, talking about defense systems generally, he said the aggressor has to find only one crucial weakness. The defender has to find them all in advance. That's a general truth about defense systems, and it's a truth that has special application in the context of computer systems, where the cannot find them all in any complex system. And there are potentially many more eyes on the attack than there are on the defense, and that, among other reasons, is why they're so hard to secure. Also, we've all experienced this. The internet was developed so that the network itself would be dumb. It would be an open system, easy to get on. You don't have to give any credentials. You don't have to give your identity. You can send anything along it. No one, in theory, is going to be monitoring it. And all the complicated stuff happens at the computers on the end, where the end users are. And people who control the code can be tricked into doing very dangerous stuff. If this can happen to Google, and it was a phishing attack, i.e. the way that we think the Google attack happened was that someone who had learned a lot of information about some email recipients sent an email to someone at Google pretending like they were someone else. And there was an attachment. You get this all the time in your spam, and you're supposed to know not to click on the attachment or click on the web link if it looks like a suspicious link. This is exactly what happened in Google. They clicked on something that downloaded some software that took over the machines, unbeknownst to them for a while. So computers are very hard to secure. Because of this, offense, everyone thinks, has a natural advantage over defense. Another characteristic of the cyber problem is that distance is obliterated. To do an attack on something in the United States, you do not have to be in the United States. You can be on the other side of the world, and at the speed of light, you can be in the United States on a computer system, on the internet. What that means is that, we'll get into this in a second, the natural defenses served by distance and geography are eliminated in this space. Another very, very important characteristic of this problem is, as I've said already, the attribution problem. Now, there seems to be a paradox here because I said we have a hard time attributing the source of attacks, and yet we think that the Google attacks came from China, and we think that the Estonian attacks came from Russia. Those attacks were very, very prominent attacks. We have a pretty good sense through some very sophisticated traceback processes. I mean, Google, which is one of the most sophisticated companies in this space that there is, called in the National Security Agency, who is the agency in charge of signals intelligence and surveillance for the United States government, to help them figure out where this came from. But even if you can trace it back to a computer in a particular country, which we can do sometimes, but often not, Because as in the North Korean case, we thought we traced it back to a computer in North Korea, and after a couple of weeks more work, it turned out that that computer in Korea was actually triggered by the computer in Miami, and they still haven't figured out whether the computer in Miami was triggered from somewhere else or not. But even if you can, with confidence, attribute the attack or the exploitation to a computer in a particular geography, that's only the beginning of the task, because you don't know who the person behind the computer was. You don't know if that person in China behind the computer was in fact someone who's a Chinese citizen, or who's just a private person who is a Chinese citizen, or if that person is associated with the Chinese government. All of those distinctions matter potentially for the law and for your ability to strike back. Attack and exploitation, as I said earlier, is automated and unbelievably fast. Here's an important point. Attack is hard to distinguish from exploitation. We can see sometimes that someone has placed a malicious computer agent inside a computer system. We don't know why it's there or what it's doing necessarily. It can just be sitting there. It can maybe be searching around for things. And it could be a giant bomb that's set to go off in a year or so. And it's extremely hard to tell just by looking at the piece of code. And so, especially hard to tell when you see that someone's in your system, and this happens not infrequently, and you don't know if they're just snooping around looking to copy stuff or if they're going to do something destructive. It's very hard to tell until it's too late. Because of all of these factors, and especially the point about speed and distance and anonymity, there are many orders of magnitude more bad actors that can do us harm from all around the globe. And they can do so usually with anonymity and usually at the speed of light. Those are some characteristics of the problem. Here are, just quickly, just running through trying to categorize the actors and the targets. So the modes of attack or exploitation that can be private, traditional crime, someone in a Russian mob, which this is something called the Russian Business Network, which is a I guess quasi-private, mostly private organization. Basically, it's called a mob in Russia that is among the most powerful players in the internet crime world. And they steal data with very powerful computer systems, very powerful attacks, very powerful, wide knowledge of vulnerabilities. And they're very successful at stealing from entities data or stealing data or intellectual property, or extorting money from other companies. So that can be crime, corporate espionage, and the like, private to private. It can also be public to public. This is traditional war or espionage, when the Chinese try to get into our military computer systems or when we try to get into theirs. Another theme I'm going to come back to is that we're doing this ourselves a lot. We're on the attack, not just on the defense, but we often think we're just on the defense. And a big part of the problem here is we are part of the problem. That's where I'm going to come to in the end. So there's a public dimension to this. There's a private public dimension. Patriotic hackers I've already talked about. It's probably the case that the attack on Google was done by private persons in China that had an uncertain relationship to the Chinese government. And this is true in the United States as well. We have lots of patriotic hackers here who are trying to infiltrate Chinese computer systems to break down their censoring mechanisms. Terrorists we're increasingly worried about. For many years, government officials didn't worry about terrorists as much because they didn't seem to have the capacities. But with the growth of organizations like the Russian Business Organization, people are more and more worried that terrorists can simply go on this flourishing black market of cyber attack weapons and cyber vulnerabilities and just buy stuff to do bad things against us. And finally, public-private, China infiltrates Google. And the points of attack that are and exploitation we're most worried about are military and intelligence systems, critical infrastructure, communication hubs, domain name system, and private industry systems and data. Okay, how does law regulate? So I'm now going to talk briefly about how law regulates offshore threats in so-called real space. The first bullet point is not a legal point. It's that geography, especially, is a natural barrier to most crimes and most military attacks and to most espionage. For most bad things that can happen to us, you actually have to be in the country, and that's costly to get in, and we can try to stop you at the border. So it turns out that a lot of attacks, and I'm talking about, by attacks, I'm using the word very broadly. I should just say bad acts from abroad. That's what I really mean. I'm talking about real space here before we get to the cyber world. And so, for example, pirated goods that are made in the United States, outside the United States, fake Gucci bags that come into the United States, or a disease that is brought into the United States, or an illegal drug that's brought into the United States, heroin or marijuana or something imported, or an antitrust violation abroad that has impacts in the United States. These are all attacks from abroad. Now, some of these things geography can take care of, or at least is resistant to, others not, but geography is a good first line of defense. And then, of course, there's domestic law. There's criminal and civil liability that we can impose on any actors that we can get jurisdiction over in the United States. There's immigration control and as well. Also, a very important means by which we regulate offshore attacks or bad things from offshore is by going through local intermediaries. So, for example, how do we regulate pirated goods from abroad like Gucci bags and Rolex watches that you can buy on the streets of New York? We don't go after the offshore provider of the bad thing. We go after the local intermediary. It's not illegal for you to wear a fake Gucci watch. It is illegal for Walmart to sell it to you. And that, by getting at the center intermediaries, we can cut out a lot of bad acts from abroad by going after locals inside the country. We also have laws that apply extraterritorially to people outside the country, but those laws ultimately for their enforcement depend on us being able to go after people and assets inside our borders. Also, international law provides relief from offshore attacks. If someone outside the United States commits a crime that has effects in the United States, we can use extradition processes. We have cooperative arrangements that allow us to either get the bad actor to the United States or to at least get information from abroad to help us prosecute or do something to them. And ultimately, if the attack is it rises to a certain level of intensity, then we go to war and the threat of war to deter those bad acts. As for exploitation or espionage, it's much the same. Geography is the main barrier to offshore espionage in real space. Domestic law doesn't provide many remedies for espionage. Basically, it's expulsion of the person or criminal liability if you get caught. And international law does not prohibit spying. It is not illegal under a violation of international law for one nation to spy on another nation. Okay, so how does those modes of regulating offshore threats, how does it work in the cyber world? There are four basic gaps. First, geography is no barrier, or at least not much of one. It's a trivial barrier. System defenses are weak for reasons I've already explained, and now I'm going to turn to why domestic law and international law are largely ineffectual. Domestic law is largely ineffectual to deal with the cyber problem because the bad actors are mostly abroad, we think. Much of the time, we don't know where the bad actors came from for their cyber attacks or cyber exploitations. If we can figure out that we're pretty sure it came from a computer in another country, there's not much that we can do about it because they're abroad. I'm going to talk about in a second why international law doesn't do much for us. So the biggest problem is that these attacks can come in huge waves from someone abroad that we often don't even know who it is. Intermediary action doesn't work here. Intermediary action is actually fairly robust. I wrote a whole book called Who Controls the Internet that was about how states can actually control a lot. They can regulate illegal digital goods from abroad through, one of the themes was through intermediary regulation. So we can do a good job of regulating copyright by making copyright violations from abroad that it might appear in the United States. By threatening Google, they better not allow that to show up in their search engine or they will violate the Copyright Act. And in fact, Google searches do not show you everything. They in fact filter things out a lot. That's one way that we regulate the internet. Another way is through financial intermediaries. Want to fix the offshore internet gambling problem? Go after Visa. That works. Or the other intermediary payment systems. And so forth and so on. So intermediary action works with many internet transactions to prevent offshore bads, but it doesn't work well with the cybercrime problem because, especially for an attack in which there's no attempt to extract money, just want to cause damage, then it's hard to have intermediary action when the attack is coming embedded in billions of communications in a little piece of code. And for exploitation, it's the same thing. It's hard to use intermediary regulation to stop a cyber exploitation from abroad. And extraterritorial regulation doesn't work for the same reason. So basically the tools we have for regulating offshore attacks, the domestic tools we have, don't work very well with regard to cybercrime and cyber exploitation. And nor do they work very well nor do the usual international law tools that we have work very well. I'm going to start with the second bullet point. These attacks happen so fast and attribution is so hard, and we have terrible cooperation agreements. They're getting better, however, but terrible cooperation agreements with officials in other countries to actually find the person, collect the evidence before it's too late, because you can clean up the tracks of the crime pretty quickly. So that's hard because it happens so quickly, because we have poor cooperative arrangements, we don't know who the actors are. Also, the first bullet point, even if we can find the actor, we often can't extradite them. There's a principle called double criminality in extradition treaties, which requires, as a prerequisite to extradition, that the person who committed the bad act outside the United States, that constituted a crime inside the United States, it has to be a crime in both countries, both the country that we're trying to extradite from and our country. In many countries, this is changing, but many countries don't have laws that allow for extradition for someone that commits a computer crime. And the famous example is the I Love You virus that caused $15 billion worth of damage, I think 10 or 15 years ago. We knew who it was. It was a 22-year-old kid who was playing around, but we couldn't extradite him because what he did was not illegal in the Philippines, and therefore the double criminality principle wasn't satisfied, therefore we couldn't extradite. There's something called the Cybercrime Convention. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but it tries to overcome these problems. It tries to overcome the international cooperation problems from cybercrimes from abroad. It's largely a failure. And it's not a terrible thing. It's a step in the right direction, but there aren't many nations who have ratified it. And the definitions of the crimes for purposes of double criminality are pretty vague. And the cooperation agreements that it sets up are all helpful, but not terribly helpful for the bulk of cybercrimes. And cyber attacks, I mean. There are also legal gaps in international law. The UN Charter is the main form of international law that regulates war, effectively. It's not called war anymore, it's called force or attack. But those very words which are in the Charter, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter prevents one country from using force against another. And Article 51 allows you to act in self-defense if you are attacked. Now both of those words, force and attack, were designed in a kinetic world for kinetic problems. They were not designed for cyber problems. And the cyber problem doesn't fit neatly into the UN Charter paradigm. So here's some questions that we don't know the answer to, but it makes it hard to know what role the UN Charter plays. When you have a cyber event in another country, does there have to be some kind of kinetic effect before it's a use of force? What level of kinetic effect? What happens if you're just spying without any damage or denigration? Traditionally, that's been lawful under the UN Charter. It's not prohibited by the UN Charter. But now espionage is enabled to such a degree, it's such a different beast that some people think maybe it should be called a use of force. What if there's mere economic damage caused by a cyber attack that doesn't rise to the level of physical or kinetic damage? What if, for example, so instead of taking down the air control system that would cause planes to crash and cause kinetic damage, what if the foreign attacker degraded banking information that made us lose confidence in a certain banking realm or in a stock exchange or something that caused massive economic damage but no physical damage? Would that be a use of force? And so forth and so on. It's very hard to translate the cyber world into the kinetic world of the UN Charter. It's also very hard to translate the cyber world into the other half of international law that regulates conflict, the jus in bello, which is the law that regulates how armed conflicts take place. So two important principles of the jus in bello, this is the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, they're otherwise known as. Geneva Conventions are important aspects of the laws of war, of the jus in bello. Two important principles of the laws of war are the principle of distinction and proportionality. The principle of distinction says military operations can only take place against military objectives and not against civilian targets. principle of proportionality says that any collateral damage on civilian targets, that's acceptable if it's not disproportionate to the military advantage gained. So you have to be able to calculate in some terms what the likely consequences for non-military targets would be before the attack is legal. There are lots of problems with applying this in the cyber world. The first one is our friend the attribution problem. It's hard to know whether you're attacking a civilian or a military target. In fact, sometimes they're the same thing. Because of the second point, the intermingling of military and civilian networks. 90 to 95% of Department of Defense communications take place over private networks. Verizon backbone, AT&T and the like. Is that a military target because of that? Also, another problem is that, this is a big problem, is it's very hard to predict the outcomes of a cyber attack. Attacking one system can have uncertain and unforeseen and sometimes massive consequences for connected systems. There can be indirect and cascading effects. One example in the news recently on this is that the New York Times reported that the Bush administration contemplated, in the run-up to the war in Iraq in 2003, contemplated basically taking down and destroying Saddam Hussein's family's bank accounts. I'm not sure what purpose that would have served, but that was being contemplated, and they decided not to do it because they weren't sure what the effects would be on other banking systems throughout the world. They couldn't be sure about the effects, so they didn't do it. I'm going to skip the deterrence. We can talk about that afterwards if you want, because time is running short. The bottom line is that there are untold thousands of unpunishable, undeterrable, very dangerous bad actors around the globe who are enabled by cyber. There's a large gap between domestic and international regulation and what it can do and the threat that's posed. Many of the most prevalent dangerous threats fall in these gaps. And the thing that I actually think is more worrisome, and if you go back and read what's in the paper, the thing that, and this is true of the Google episode, we think, it's not cyber attacks, it's cyber exploitation. We're having things stolen left, right, and center from us. Our most valuable assets are embodied in information on computer systems that are being stolen at an increasing rate. And I think that is the greatest danger presented by the cyber threat. Okay. Why legal reform is hard. So if you go back, and the government every 3 or 4 years does a study of the cyber problem. Have a big commission that looks at the problem anew, and they always end up saying the same thing. If you go back, there have been 5 or 6 reports since the mid-1990s. They basically all say the same thing. I'm going to go through some of the things they say. We know what we need to do along some dimensions to increase our defenses and lower the possibility of something really bad happening. But we can't do it for political and economic reasons because nothing terrible has happened yet. It's a familiar dilemma that democracies face. So the security levels in computer systems in the private sector are actually quite important. We are part of the problem. Individual computer users are part of the problem because our computers are insecure. And our computers, we don't, I mean, most of you probably have some sort of virus protection software. Maybe you have a firewall. But you could still be part of a botnet and not know it, and you probably wouldn't care as long as it didn't affect the functioning of your computer for your purposes. And so we don't take optimal incentives, probably very few of us do, to prevent our own computer systems from being used as a basis for an attack on a third party, either through a botnet, which can do denial of service attacks, like I talked about, these giant, massive thrusts of requests on computer websites that causes them to crash. Or these botnets are generators of spam. Many of us probably contribute to the spam problem because our computers are surreptitiously being used to create and send spam. And spam not only clogs up the net, but it can be an agent it can be a way to hide and distribute bad attacks. Also because our credentials get stolen because we're not taking security seriously enough. And those credentials can be used by a bad actor inside our firms and workplaces to get at stuff that's more valuable. So we don't take optimal precautions. Corporations probably don't take optimal precautions, especially if you think about firms being vital national security assets like the economic sector, the transportation sector, the communication sector, and the like. And these private networks, they all have incentives to take defense seriously, and many of them do, but probably not to the level of security that's appropriate for national security. They're going to protect their systems for their purposes, but not going to take into account all the third-party protections all the negative costs that they would be imposing on others that they're not going to be responsible for if they don't take optimal precautions. So many private actors lack incentives to take optimal defense measures. I've just gone through some individual users. Software manufacturers are a big part of the problem. We buy software from Microsoft and other firms that's massively vulnerable. That is a large part of the problem. It's gotten a lot better, Microsoft software, but it's still full of holes, like most of all software is actually. But it could be better, but software manufacturers have little incentive to make it better because they don't suffer any liability costs when something terrible happens in the computer system. For a lot of reasons, they're not liable, and therefore they don't worry as much about the third-party harms that they cause. Internet service providers are the same thing. Internet service providers, the Comcasts and Verizons of the world, however you get on the net, they could do a lot to clean up botnets and spam, but it would be costly to them, and they have no incentive to do so, so they don't. Now, everybody agrees that at some level, one of the things we have to do in the domestic system is to change the law to force all the actors I've talked about to internalize all these costs, to make software manufacturers liable for the harms that their software causes, if we can think of a way to do it, so that they are internalizing those costs, and so they are not rushing out software just to get it out as fast as they can, but they're taking better steps to make it more secure. Individual users. Should we be allowed on the internet if we're contributing to a botnet or to spam attacks? Perhaps not. But that means that there's going to have to have some system where the ISPs perhaps are monitoring that relationship, and that's going to raise the cost of our ISP subscription. By the way, the software regulation is going to raise the price of software gigantically, enormously, and probably cut down on innovation in software. Lots of legal solutions we can think of that would help to fix the cybersecurity problem by forcing a variety of actors across a variety of spaces to take cybersecurity more seriously, but they're all expensive. They're very, very expensive. They raise the cost of doing business on the internet and with computers. They're politically costly. No one likes to impose costs because we can't see the problem, so what are we paying all this extra money for? There are economic costs, and there are generativity costs, what my colleague Jonathan Zittrain calls generativity costs. Because basically when you clamp down and insist on more and more cybersecurity, it's harder to innovate. Not only because it's more expensive, but because when the computer systems become more controlled and more applianced, as he calls it, then it's hard to introduce innovation. He's written a wonderful book about that called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. So domestic law fixes are hard politically, economically, and from the perspective of innovation, and therefore we haven't done them. Another thing that we might do that is enormously controversial is to have the federal government inside the networks looking for bad agents. Now, one way of describing the problem of the cyber threat is that the U.S. government normally has access and control over the channels of military attack on the homeland. If something is coming at us by air, sea, or land, the government has the authority to regulate that, to stop whomever it wants, and to strike them down if it needs to. It has complete access to those channels of attack. It doesn't have access to the cyber channels of attack. The cyber channels of attack are owned and controlled by private companies, telecommunication firms primarily. And we think of these telecommunication systems as communication systems and data storage systems, the kind of things the government shouldn't be involved with too much, the kind of things we need protection for the government for, the kind of thing the Fourth Amendment was designed for, and maybe the First Amendment. Because we think about them as communication media and because we think about them as data storage media, we think the government shouldn't be involved. But they're also channels of attack. And they're channels of attack that we're getting killed with every day. So some people think that the government should be in there working with the Verizons and the AT&Ts of the world, doing their best to come up with, and there are all sorts of systems that can try to do things like this, intrusion detection, intrusion prevention systems, cooperating with the private sector to try to find and preempt and stop and shut down malicious attacks. Now, unfortunately, the government agency best equipped to do this is a government agency called the National Security Agency, otherwise known as No Such Agency because it used to be so secretive. This is the agency with unbelievable capacities for electronic surveillance and unbelievable capacities for finding and stopping malicious computer attacks. But because of those unbelievable capacities, people are afraid of it. This is the same agency that was involved in the very controversial terror surveillance program. And we've had a very strong cultural/legal sense that the NSA should not be operating in the homeland, that its giant ears should be out there doing other things but not operating in the homeland. And that is a major hurdle to having them do the things that we need to have them do in our networks to keep us safer. For reasons I can go into in question and answer if you want, I don't think the Fourth Amendment is a hurdle. I think politics is a hurdle, but it's a very, very large hurdle for obvious reasons to having the government heavily involved in monitoring the network for malicious agents. International law fixes are also hard for reasons I've already explained. First of all, it's hard to attribute, as I've said many times. It's hard to reach an international agreement with other nations about how to fix this problem because there are just too many actors, public and private. And we don't know who they are. We don't know if it's states or private actors because of the attribution problem. It's very hard. The Chinese have denied any responsibility for the Google thing, and it's very hard for us to prove otherwise. It's very hard to come to an agreement on what this cooperation should look like. We have radically different ideas than, say, the Chinese, just almost diametrically different ideas about what type of things it's appropriate to stop and what type of things it's appropriate not to stop. Whatever agreement we could reach, verification would be nearly impossible because of the attribution problem, hard verification. And finally, and a very important point, we are the problem. Our government and our country is the problem because we are the leading source of cyber attacks and cyber exploitations. I'm not joking. You read in the newspapers about how worried we are, how terrible it is what the Chinese are doing to Google, and how terrible it is about all these attacks on the Department of Defense, and how terrible it is that we're having our software from our military systems sucked down by some foreign government or foreign entity. There was a survey a couple of months ago by McAfee asking technology experts from critical infrastructure systems around the world where was the biggest source of computer network attacks. The United States won. And it's true. We have the biggest or the near biggest botnets. Our computers are the least secure and the biggest source of botnets. They're the source of a lot of these attacks. We are a leading source of hacktivism. Hacktivism is private parties doing something that they think is right against a computer system somewhere else, but that's called a cyber attack. What we think the Chinese are doing to Google, when my colleagues at the Berkman Center, my friends at the Berkman Center, try to help firms in China defeat the censors in China, the Chinese see that as a cyber attack, and it is a cyber attack, and it is a cyber exploitation. And we're heavily in that business. Hillary Clinton gave a speech a couple of months ago about how terrible cyber attacks were and how we had to do something to stop them. And 6 paragraphs later, she started talking about subsidizing hacktivists to fight back and didn't even see the connection. We have the most robust, by all accounts, and aggressive surveillance system. The National Security Agency is all over the world, inside people's computer systems and listening to or at least listening to communications and often inside computer systems. And although it's highly classified, by many accounts, we have the most powerful and sophisticated offensive weapons, and we've been using them. It's very hard, and I really think this is the biggest part of the problem in terms of international cooperation. We in this country have not begun to take seriously all the things that we would have to do in cutting back on our offensive capabilities to get any kind of reciprocal cooperation from other countries in doing so. We haven't begun to have that conversation. Last slide, the future. So this is, for what it's worth, where I think we're going. First of all, we're in a giant invisible arms race right now. And I mean giant. And it's not just an arms race between countries to develop better and better offensive attack and exploitation weapons. It's also individuals. It's also big organizations like the Russian Business Organization. There's a flourishing, unbelievably flourishing black market, as I said, in cyber attacks and vulnerabilities. And the problem is getting worse very quickly because the bad guys have found ways to monetize this and to make money off of it. And so every report that comes out, and I can't verify these, but there are enough of them from enough credible sources to suggest that the problem is getting worse very quickly. And we in the United States are heavily and quickly and massively investing in our offensive capabilities as well. So as far as I can tell, this is the U.S. strategy. Basically muddle through until there's a big cyber event. Until we have a cyber 9/11 or, as Richard Clark called it, a cyber Pearl Harbor, I don't think we're going to take this problem seriously. There's just not the political will to take the difficult steps we need to start acting more intelligently and responsibly in computer systems. The second thing, if I follow what's going on in Congress, and Congress hasn't done too much on this in terms of changing and improving laws, which are quite antiquated. But it seems like Congress is going to do what it usually does when there's a big national security problem and it doesn't know what to do. Delegate open-ended authority to the president, who ends up doing things in secret. And as far as I can tell, I used to be in the government, but I'm not revealing any classified information. I don't know anything about this. Most of the progress is being made in secret. There's something called the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, CNCI, that the Obama administration has released an outline of. It's very highly classified about what the government's been doing very aggressively to deal with the problem. It's happening in secret. We don't know what's going on. Here's one hint of what's going on. The National Security Agency is building a 1.5 billion, 1 million square foot data storage entity in Utah for cybersecurity. That's all we know. We have no idea what they're doing. But that we know. They're doing something, I promise you. We're going to enhance resilience. The basic, in other words, try to take steps for our most important data and most important computer systems to try to make them harder to breach, and if they are breached, to try to make it more difficult to do something bad to them. Suggestion in the Wall Street Journal today, this morning, there was an article about how the State Department has begun an initiative to try to hold other nations responsible for attacks that originate from their borders, even if they claim not to know about the attack and not to be responsible for the attack. And that's a nice initiative, but until we start doing the same to ourselves, it's going to go nowhere. Here's another thing I'm sure we're going to do. Offense is defense. General Alexander, who's the head of the NSA, and also the head of the new Cyber Command, which is going to be run by the NSA, which is going to coordinate all American defensive and offensive cyber operations. He has said, he said publicly, if the Chinese are going to do something bad to us, I want to be in their computers and know about it before it happens. And that's what we're going to increasingly do. And finally, and this is the point I've been making, I think there's going to be no real progress internationally until the United States comes clean on, it's not a secret, but until they face up to the notion that its offensive activities are profound, and until it takes steps to curb them or think about what it could curb as a trade-off for other reciprocal agreements from other nations. Until we take that idea seriously, which we're not at all right now, I don't think we're going to be making any progress on this problem. I've gone 10 minutes longer than I thought. I spoke very quickly. I hope you understood some of it. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions. There are microphones circulating, so please wait until the person with the microphone finds you. And I'll let Professor Goldsmith officiate.
Go ahead.
Oh, that was fast. I understand that is it the 24th Air Force that's been created? Are you familiar with that? And how does that relate to the NSA?
Well, I don't know the name of it, but each of the military services have their own cyber units, and I think the 24th Air Command is the cyber unit now for the Air Force.
I thought it was they were claiming control over. They should be the.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. I think that was the Gambit, but it was announced last October. That was the Air Force was ahead of everyone else in this, and they were ahead of the game. And there was a gambit made, I'm dim on this, but there was a gambit made by the Air Force to be the operational center for our cyber activities within the military. But Cyber Command, under the direction of the NSA, was tentatively set up by Secretary of Defense Gates last October, and they're going to be the agency, led by General Alexander, coordinating our offensive activities. It hasn't fully been operationalized yet. I just learned that he's going to have his confirmation hearing soon. We'll learn hopefully a lot more about what Cyber Command is about then. We don't know much yet. Yes, over here and then over there.
In 2003, there was a major power outage in the Northeast, and in 2001, we had the attack on 9/11 that shut down one of 4 major arteries leading to New England, and an area of Manhattan the size of downtown Cleveland. And I'm wondering, when a cyber attack, and we survived those, I'm wondering, in a cyber attack, what is the physical threat or the real dramatic?
So what does McConnell mean? What could he possibly mean when he says that the attack could be equivalent of a nuclear attack? What could he mean? And I have no idea what the likelihood of this is. And as I said, I'm much more worried about the theft side and the exploitation side than I am about the attack side, although I'm not quite sure why that is. What he means is the following. When the markets were seizing up 2 years ago, when people didn't trust the numbers and the economy was going in the tank and everyone thought we were on a rolling, it was going to get much, much, much worse than it actually was. That's the kind of thing that could happen if all of a sudden, if the SWIFT interbank transfer system, by which trillions of dollars every day are transferred around the globe, if that became, it's all done by computers. It's just all digits. It's all bits. All of our economy is grounded in bits. If we lost confidence in that because that data somehow became corrupted, the ripple effects throughout our economy would be devastating. And people would stop transacting out of uncertainty, the fear is, in ways that would make what happened 2 years ago look like child's play. That's one thing. Another thing that could happen, and I'm really not expert enough to assess the likelihood of this, but our electrical grids are and are increasingly connected to the internet. And if the electricity went out not for a couple of days, but for a couple of weeks, that would be a massive, massive, maybe not to the effect of a nuclear attack, but a massive setback to our nation. Those are the kind of things he worries about. Again, I don't know how to assess that. And it's very hard to assess. And the truth is that experts disagree. But that's the kind of thing that he worries about. Yes, sir.
Could you comment on how cyber attacks and cyber exploitation can affect the First Amendment? Like if a person knows that their computer is going to be destroyed by hackers if they access certain websites, isn't that a way to make those websites unavailable? I mean, virtually unavailable without actually shutting them down.
You mean if someone is worried if they visit a website or they contribute to a website that the government will crack down on them? Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, whoever it is that's hacking, if they're from the government, if they're those who are sympathetic to the government or sympathetic to certain ideological principles.
So it's a hard question to answer, but in general, I would say that the First Amendment primarily regulates government regulation of speech and not private regulation of speech. So it wouldn't be in play at all for any of the stuff that's going on private to private on the internet. There is a worry that if something like, if the NSA gets in the business of copying every communication that goes on in the United States for purposes of doing a cyber analysis, there is going to be a First Amendment worry. The main worry is the Fourth Amendment, illegal searches and seizures or unreasonable searches and seizures. But there's potentially a First Amendment problem there as well if people are chilled from certain activities because they think the government is cracking down on certain forms of speech. But that is not the primary problem, in my opinion. Yes, sir?
Enjoyed your talk. Now, my question is, you talk about like a nuclear, the equivalent of a nuclear attack by shutting all the grids down.
That was McConnell. That was me quoting the Director of National
Okay, now
Intelligence.
suppose it happens. Should we respond by actually using bombs, or should we respond in kind by doing the same thing to them, by shutting down?
It's a great question, and it's a great question.
Thanks.
And I was on a National Research Council study with a lot of fancy people that know a lot more about this than I do, and we couldn't come up with an answer to that question. It would depend, but part of the problem is, first of all, there's no legal or other requirement that you have to respond to a cyber attack with cyber. And a better way, I've been thinking about this problem and talking about it artificially as if it's only happening in the cyber realm. But of course, you could respond to a cyber attack with a kinetic attack. You could drop a bomb on someone in response or to deter them from doing so. You could respond in the cyber world. So let me just say two scenarios. I don't have a good answer. The big problem we have is if we know if something bad is happening, let's say that something terrible started happening to the electrical grid. And we had a pretty good sense that it was coming from China. The problem is we don't have nearly the same confidence. The slide I skipped about deterrence and nuclear weapons. In the nuclear world, we could tell where the missile was coming from. And therefore it made retaliation relatively easy, and that made deterrence and deterrence strategies and legal strategies relatively easy. Deterrence is much harder here, and responses are much harder because the attribution problem is always going to be hard. And then there's the question of, well, what would we do, actually? Let's say it wasn't a devastating attack, but let's just say that it was just a really massive economic attack by the Chinese on some stock exchange or some bank that caused hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars of losses, just like that. Well, would we drop bombs on the Chinese? Would we kill people because of that? Some people think we should, some people think we shouldn't. It's hard. And these are things that the government does not have answers to. It's trying to sort out. They're very good questions. That's all I can say.
We've reached the bottom of the hour, so please join me in thanking you.
Thank you. Sorry, I
Professor Goldsmith, even though your subject was a threat from something we can't see,
Yes, that's the
we
problem.
thought you might like to have something tangible to remember.
Thank you
us by.
very
So
much.
This is a small token
Oh, I
of our
appreciate it.
appreciation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions.
We have a reception which occurs right behind us in the rotunda, so please join us for the reception. If you have additional questions, I'm sure Professor Goldsmith would be glad to address
I'll be
them.
happy to take your questions. Sorry, I